Namaskar. Well, friends, let me welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. This audio video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Ambedkar, on his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the great vision that he had for our country. This is what this podcast series is all about. Friends, before we proceed, let me remind you that if you like this podcast series, please like it, share it, and subscribe to it. Let's proceed. Having discussed Dr. Ambedkar's role as an economist extraordinaire in as many as 5 different episodes, episode 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, let's now turn to another dimension of Dr. Ambedkar's multidimensional personality. And this role is Dr. Ambedkar as a social reformer. In this episode 8, I would like to speak about the beginning of Dr. Ambedkar's mass movements. Dr. Ambedkar, as we have seen, returned to India in 1923, having completed his education, higher education in America and in England, and in the process getting the highest degrees in the leading universities of the world. So he came back in 1923 and he started his first mass movement as early as in 1924. Please note that when he started his first mass movement, he had enormous difficulties making the two ends meet at the family level. He had to undergo a very difficult economic situation at home, and nevertheless, he started his first mass movement. On March 9th, 1924, Dr. Ambedkar founded a social organization for the upliftment of the downtrodden, upliftment of untouchables. This organization was called Bahishkrit Hitakarini Sabha. The motto of this organization was educate, organize, and agitate. This was going to resonate throughout the country for decades. As a matter of fact, it does even now. Having launched a mass movement, the initial strategy of Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar was to position his movement as a struggle for civic rights for the untouchables. And it all started with Chavdar Lake Satyagraha or Chavdar Lake struggle. On March 19, 1927, Dr. Ambedkar's social organization, Bahishkrit Hitakarini Sabha, made an appeal to organize a conference of untouchables. At that time, untouchables were also called depressed classes. So there was a conference organized for upliftment of the depressed classes. And the place chosen was Mahad, which is in the Konkan region of Maharashtra. The response given to Dr. Ambedkar's call was simply unprecedented. More than 10,000 people of all ages came there, mostly wearing rags and carrying bhakris. And they assembled from all over. In this historic meeting, Dr. Ambedkar first explained how the British had let the untouchables down. And he urged his followers to keep alive the new fire of awareness that was created. Dr. Ambedkar appealed to the untouchables that had gathered to rebel against the humiliating and enslaving tradition of village duties. There were many village duties which Dalits or untouchables were supposed to perform as a matter of tradition. For example, one of the duty of the untouchables was to carry the carcasses of the dead cattle from the village to the outskirts. And then there was a procedure to deal with that. This was dehumanizing and enslaving kind of village tradition that was going on. Dr. Ambedkar made an appeal to rebel against such humiliating and enslaving tradition of village duties. Dr. Ambedkar said, and this is very important, I quote, "You may ask me, why leave assured half bread for an imaginary full bread? But I must warn you, if you do not do what I say, you will not get even this half bread in the times to come." Unquote. On the first day of conference, several resolutions were made, including allowing the untouchables to access water from all waterfronts. As a matter of fact, for hundreds of years, untouchables were prevented from collecting water from the places where the so-called upper caste would access to water. In 1926, something historic happened. The then government of Bombay province was a very big one which had Maharashtra as well as Gujarat together. That government adopted a resolution abolishing such a discrimination about water. So they said that there would be no discrimination. Everybody should be able to access water from the waterfronts, which are public reservoirs. Accordingly, the Mahad municipality also had passed a resolution to allow untouchables full access to all waterfronts in Mahad. Now, in Mahad, the largest reservoir of drinking water was called Chavdar Lake. Chavdar means tasty. Chavdar Lake, Chavdar Lake, that was the largest reservoir of drinking water. The resolution was applicable everywhere, including the Chavdar Lake, but it was not made operational. Around this cause, Dr. Ambedkar chose to launch a mass movement of the downtrodden people. On the second day of conference, that is on March 20th, 1927, unexpectedly, in the conference, an announcement was made. Let's go to Chavdar Lake and implement the Mahad municipality resolution. And there began a historic march on that day. The congregation of more than 10,000 people, they marched to Chavdar Lake with, of course, Dr. Ambedkar leading the procession. They were marching in a disciplined manner, in rows of four, shouting the slogans, educate, organize, and agitate. The so-called upper caste people, they were shocked beyond their belief, and they looked on. After reaching the Chavdar Lake, Dr. Ambedkar walked down the steps with firm resolve and looking at thousands of the expectant followers, Dr. Ambedkar calmly bent down, cupped some water in his hands and drank. The crowds roared amid the cheers of glory to Dr. Ambedkar. Then everybody followed the suit Everybody took a symbolic sip of water. A social revolution had begun. While addressing the excited crowd, Dr. Ambedkar proclaimed that the untouchables were exercising their rights as human beings. A couple of hours later, a large crowd of the so-called upper caste people, armed with bamboo sticks, they gathered on the street corners and everywhere. They attacked the protesters and beat them mercilessly. Why? For polluting their water. The protesters were screaming with rage. They were itching for a retaliation. One word or a simple signal from Dr. Ambedkar, and the whole city would have turned into a battlefield. But Dr. Ambedkar appealed for peace. Look what he said. He said that our struggle is to enforce the law, not to break it. Dr. Ambedkar emerged in this process as the savior of the untouchables, lighting in their minds the flames of awakening to self-respect and self-elevation. On August 4, 1927, the Mahad municipality revoked its earlier resolution and once again denied the untouchable access to Chavdar Lake for water. Dr. Ambedkar took it as a challenge and announced that he would intensify the struggle, and that is what he did. In 1927, December, there was even a bigger gathering at Mahad. Dr. Ambedkar explained to the cheering crowd that the Mahad Satyagraha was for laying the foundation of equality. Dr. Ambedkar challenged the authority of Hindu scriptures. He said, and this is very important, and I quote, "If you say your religion is our religion, then your rights and our rights must be the same. Are they same? They are not. If they are not, then on what grounds do you think we should continue to remain in the Hindu fold?" This was the first time Dr. Ambedkar had raised this issue. On that day, that is December 25, 1927, Dr. Ambedkar particularly denounced the Manusmriti. According to Dr. Ambedkar, Manusmriti was a charter of rights for the so-called upper caste Hindus, but it was a Bible of slavery for the untouchables. He condemned Manusmriti as a symbol of tyranny. Dr. Ambedkar then gave a call to publicly burn the copies of Manusmriti, the holy book. That evening, on December 25th, 1927, the Manusmriti was placed on a special pyre and ceremoniously put to fire amid cheers from the untouchables. This bold gesture of Dr. Ambedkar electrified Dr. Ambedkar's mass movement. On the other hand, it also demonstrated that untouchables were no longer willing to abide by the religious and ritualistic confinements which were propagated and imposed by the so-called upper caste Hindus. The next day, that is December 26, 1927, the conference was converted into a committee where outsiders were not allowed. Dr. Ambedkar, in a closed-door meeting, proposed to organize a satyagraha, cautioning the gathering about the possible suffering that they may have. He then requested the gathering to speak either for or against satyagraha, the true democrat that he was. Since the majority voted in favor of satyagraha, Dr. Ambedkar told them that he would invite the collector to address them and they could have a final decision only thereafter. That evening, the collector addressed the gathering. The collector spoke about the prohibitory orders of the court and advised them to desist from the proposed satyagraha. Then there was a considerable debate among the protesters after the collector had left. Next day, that is December 27, 1927, Dr. Ambedkar moved a resolution for deferment of satyagraha till the court decision on the civil suit that was filed by the so-called upper caste people. Later that day, all the assembled people took out a rally in Mahad, encircling the Chavdar Lake. They did not actually enter the lake, but literally captured it by surrounding it from all sides. Ironically, following the Chavdar Lake Protest earlier, the orthodoxy of Mahad, mostly the upper caste, they had purified, quote unquote, purified the desecrated, they purified the so desecrated lake. And how did they do it? They did it by pouring into it pots of curd, pots of milk, pots of cow dung, and pots of cow urine amid loud religious chants. Within months after that, in the very same place, Manusmriti was put on fire. In doing so, Dr. Ambedkar had succeeded in converting the fight for right to drinking water into a socio-cultural struggle for the entire downtrodden masses. Well, friends, with this, let's conclude the session today. In the next episode, that is episode number 9, I propose to continue our discussion of Dr. Ambedkar as a great social reformer. And more specifically, we will be talking about Dr. Ambedkar's temple entry movements. Before I take your leave, let me say this. If you like this podcast series, like it, share it, subscribe to it. Thank you. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.